A Study in Scarlet Seals. This is an original production from Nightmare Narratives. It is a new Sherlock Holmes homage written in the classic style of Arthur Conan Doyle, inspired by the world of Sherlock Holmes and classic Gothic literature. A Study in Scarlet Seals. Read by Daniel Sutap. It was during a bleak November afternoon when a fine London rain clung stubbornly to the windows of Baker Street, that the curious affair of the Harbury signet first came to the attention of Sherlock Holmes. Holmes had spent the greater part of that day in a state of restless impatience. A small chemical apparatus occupied the corner of our sitting room table, and the air carried the faint acrid scent of reagents which he had been subjecting to a series of experiments whose purpose he did not trouble to explain to me. When these trials failed to produce the stimulation he desired, he abandoned them entirely and took up his violin. From my chair beside the fire, I watched him with the quiet amusement of one long accustomed to his habits. Holmes's moods, when deprived of suitable intellectual challenge, tended either toward languid indifference or bursts of almost feverish activity. On this occasion, he alternated between both. "You perceive, Watson," said he suddenly, lowering the bow across the strings, "that the criminal classes have grown intolerably dull of late." "I suspect they have merely grown cautious," I replied, folding the newspaper upon my knee. Holmes smiled faintly. "A regrettable development." This narration and story. It was at this moment that Mrs. Hudson announced a visitor. The gentleman who entered our rooms bore the unmistakable air of one long familiar with formal society. He was tall, spare of build, and carried himself with that restrained dignity which I have often observed among members of the older aristocratic families. Yet the composure of his manner could not entirely conceal the anxiety in his eyes. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" he asked. Holmes inclined his head. "My name is Sir Julian Harbury," the visitor continued. "I come regarding a matter which, though it may appear domestic in nature, has implications of considerable legal importance." Holmes gestured toward a chair. "You interest me already, Sir Julian." The gentleman removed a small velvet case from his coat and laid it carefully upon the table between us. Inside were two rings. Both bore the same crest, a lion rampant beneath a crown, finely engraved upon a heavy gold signet. "This," Sir Julian said, lifting one of them, "is the Harbury family signet ring. It has been used for generations to seal all documents concerning inheritance, land transfers, and internal family agreements." "And the second ring?" Holmes asked quietly. "That," Sir Julian replied, "is the difficulty." Holmes leaned forward and took the rings into his long fingers. Instantly I saw the transformation come over him. The languor vanished, his keen gray eyes brightened with the quick alertness I had come to recognize as the surest sign that a problem had captured his interest. "You believe one of these to be a duplicate?" "Yes. The discovery was made only yesterday, on the eve of a formal inheritance ceremony at our estate in Surrey. During that ceremony, the ring is traditionally used to seal several documents before the assembled family." Holmes examined the engraving through his lens. "Most curious," he murmured. "What do you observe?" Sir Julian asked. Holmes placed the rings side by side upon the table. "The workmanship is excellent," said he, "yet there are differences. The engraving here is marginally deeper, while the wear along the interior of the band suggests many years of habitual use." He lifted the other ring. "This one lacks that history." Sir Julian leaned forward anxiously. "Then the duplicate was made recently?" Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he turned the ring slowly beneath the lamplight. "A signet ring," he said at last, "acquires the habits of its owner as surely as a pipe or walking stick." He returned both rings to their case and closed it gently. "Tell me, Sir Julian," Holmes continued, "who among your family would stand to benefit should the authority of this ring fall briefly into other hands?" Sir Julian hesitated. "There is a cousin," he admitted, "Mr. Adrian Melville, a charming fellow, though perhaps ambitious." Holmes leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "And tomorrow evening," he said quietly, "this ring will once again be used before witnesses." "Yes." Holmes glanced at me with the faintest trace of satisfaction. "My dear Watson," said he, "it appears we must pay a visit to Surrey." The journey to the Harbury estate the following morning passed in relative quiet, though Holmes's manner had undergone the familiar transformation which always accompanied the appearance of an interesting problem. Where he had been languid the previous day, he now displayed the alert, economical. He spent much of the railway journey examining the 2 rings Sir Julian had entrusted us. At intervals, he held them up to the gray daylight of the carriage window, turning them slowly between his fingers. Once he even pressed one gently against the soft leather of his glove, as though testing the manner in which it would meet wax. "You observe, Watson," he remarked without looking up, "that imitation, however skillful, is rarely patient enough to reproduce the gradual history of use." I confess the distinction still escaped me, though I could clearly perceive that Holmes had already advanced further in his reasoning than he cared to reveal. The Harbury estate lay several miles beyond the nearest station, approached by a long gravel drive lined with dark yew trees, whose branches met overhead like the arch of a cathedral nave. The house itself was of considerable antiquity, broad, low, and built of weathered stone, which bore the marks of several centuries of English rain and wind. Within, the atmosphere was one of restrained ceremony. Portraits of former Harburys gazed down from paneled walls, and the servants moved with that quiet discipline which speaks of a household accustomed to established rituals. Sir Julian received us in the library, where his father, Lord Harbury, sat beside a small coal fire. The old nobleman's hands trembled slightly with age, yet his voice retained the firm authority of a man long accustomed to command. "The ceremony proceeds tonight," he said. "It has never been postponed in my lifetime." Holmes inclined his head politely. "Tradition, my lord, is often the very stage upon which interesting events choose to occur." The household members were introduced shortly thereafter. Among them was the cousin Sir Julian had mentioned, Mr. Adrian Melville, a man perhaps 10 years younger than his host, whose manner possessed an easy charm that seemed calculated rather than spontaneous. Melville spoke freely of the evening ceremony. "It is essential," said he with a light laugh, "that the order of proceedings be remembered correctly. The ring is placed on the tray before the second course, and the sealing occurs immediately thereafter. It has always been so." Holmes listened. "I admire precision," he said quietly. Another figure who attracted my attention was Mrs. Alden, the elderly nurse who had long attended Lord Harbury. I noticed her once or twice moving about the dining room during preparations, adjusting objects upon the table with an anxious thoroughness. At one point she appeared to linger beside the small silver tray upon which the signet ring would later rest. The gesture was fleeting, yet I confess it struck me as curious. Dinner that evening was conducted with great formality. The long table gleamed beneath the lamplight, while outside the tall windows the autumn wind moved restlessly through the trees. At the appointed moment, a servant placed the silver tray before Lord Harbury. Upon it lay the signet ring. Holmes watched the proceedings with a stillness that I had learned to interpret as intense concentration. The old nobleman pressed the ring into softened sealing wax upon a folded document. The wax gave off a faint resinous odor as it cooled. A distinct click sounded as the heavy library door closed behind one of the servants. Melville spoke again from across the table. "You see, Mr. Holmes, the precise moment is always the same, before the second course." Holmes smiled faintly but said nothing. Later that evening, after the household had retired, Holmes requested permission to examine several documents sealed during the ceremony. Sir Julian readily obliged. Holmes studied the impressions carefully beneath his lens. After several minutes, he rose abruptly. "Watson," said he, "we must step outside." The night air had grown sharp, and a thin mist hung low over the garden. Holmes moved quickly along the gravel path until we reached a small gate opening toward the village road. "You are wondering," he said, "why I showed such interest in the angle of the seal." "I am indeed." Holmes knelt briefly beside the gate, where the ground had been churned into soft mud by recent rain. "There are occasions," he said, "when a craftsman's work may betray him more readily than his conscience." He pointed to us. The man hesitated only briefly. "A gentleman requested a ring some weeks ago," he admitted. "Ah." Holmes thanked him and stepped back into the night. As we returned toward the house, he said quietly, "The ring was commissioned in advance. That much is now certain." "And the culprit?" Holmes glanced toward the darkened windows of the estate. "The difficulty, Watson, lies not in identifying who possessed the duplicate," he paused, "but in determining precisely when the substitution occurred." Holmes smiled faintly. "Precisely." At that moment, Sir Julian entered the room, his expression suggesting that the night had brought little rest. "Mr. Holmes," said he, "I trust your inquiries have produced some clarity." "They have produced a question," Holmes replied. Sir Julian looked surprised. Holmes held up the seal. "The ring used during the ceremony does not reflect the habits of its owner." Sir Julian frowned. "But the ring was never out of sight." Holmes turned slightly. "Was it not?" Sir Julian hesitated. Holmes continued in the same calm tone. "You will recall that the tray was placed upon the table before dinner began. Several persons moved about the room at that time. I could see that Sir Julian was thinking of the same small incident that had caught my own attention. "The nurse," I said. "Mrs. Alden was adjusting the tray." Sir Julian nodded. "She has attended my father for 20 years." Holmes did not dismiss the suggestion outright, though I noticed that he regarded it with the same thoughtful reserve he always applied to an explanation that appeared too convenient. "The possibility cannot be ignored," he said, "yet it leaves certain questions unanswered." "What questions?" Sir Julian asked. Holmes turned toward the window. "Why a duplicate ring should be required at all?" Sir Julian stared at him. Holmes went on. "A simple theft would achieve nothing. The value of the signet lies not in the gold, but in its authority." At that moment, Adrian Melville entered the library. "Good morning, gentlemen," said he cheerfully, though I detected a strain in his voice. I trust the mystery of the ring progresses." Holmes regarded him with mild interest. "It progresses steadily." Melville crossed to the writing table and glanced at the seals. "You have been examining the ceremony closely." Holmes nodded. "I find the order of events most instructive." Melville laughed lightly. "As I told you last night, the sequence is always the same. The tray is placed before the second course, the ring is used immediately thereafter, and the documents are sealed." Holmes's eyes flickered briefly. "Indeed." After Melville left the room, Holmes remained silent for several minutes. Then he spoke quietly. "You noticed, Watson, how carefully he repeats that sequence?" "Yes." Holmes tapped the table with one long finger. "It is the language of rehearsal." I stared at him. "You believe he prepared witnesses?" Holmes nodded slowly. "Consider the advantage. If everyone present remembers the ring appearing at precisely the same moment, then the substitution must have occurred afterward." "But you believe the exchange happened earlier?" "Exactly." Holmes rose and paced slowly across the room. "The duplicate ring was commissioned weeks ago. That much the jeweler confirmed last night." He stopped beside the mantel. "But the crucial point lies in the where inside the band." I recalled his earlier remark in Baker Street. "A ring acquires the habits of its owner." Holmes's eyes brightened. "Just so. The ring used last night showed no such history, yet it was handled by Lord Harbury without hesitation." "You mean—" Holmes turned toward me. "The substitution occurred before the ceremony began." At that moment we heard voices in the hall as members of the household gathered for the morning meal. Holmes slipped the seals into his pocket. "It is time," he said quietly. "For what?" Holmes allowed himself the faintest smile. "To discover whether Mr. Adrian Melville's memory of last evening proves as precise under examination as it does in conversation." The family assembled in the drawing room shortly after luncheon, at Sir Julian's request. The room itself possessed that subdued dignity which seems inseparable from the houses of old English families. Tall windows admitting a grey winter light, shelves of leather-bound volumes, and a marble mantel above which hung the portrait of a Harbury ancestor in judicial robes. Lord Harbury was seated near the fire. Sir Julian stood beside him. Adrian Melville took a position near the center of the room with an air of studied composure, which to my eye had become slightly strained since the previous evening. Holmes waited until the household had settled before he spoke. "The matter of the signet ring," said he calmly, "appears at first to be a question of theft. In truth, it concerns something rather more deliberate." He removed the leather case from his pocket and placed the two rings upon the table. "You have before you the genuine Harbury ring and its duplicate." Sir Julian leaned forward anxiously. Holmes continued. "Both rings are finely made, yet one carries the small histories of long use, while the other bears only the superficial marks of recent manufacture." He lifted a document sealed during the ceremony. "Last evening, Lord Harbury sealed several papers during the family dinner. The crest upon these seals is accurate, but the manner in which the pressure was applied differs subtly from that found upon earlier documents." Lord Harbury frowned. "I have sealed letters in the same way for years." "Precisely, my lord," Holmes replied gently, "and habit leaves traces." He placed the recent seals beside older family documents, which Sir Julian had produced from the archives. You observe that the earlier seals incline slightly to the right. The impressions made last night do not." A murmur passed through the room. Holmes turned to Adrian Melville. "You were most helpful last evening in describing the precise order of events at dinner." Melville gave a thin smile. "I merely recalled the tradition." "You recalled it repeatedly," Holmes said quietly. The cousin shifted slightly but said nothing. Holmes continued. "You stated that the ring was placed upon the tray immediately before the second course. You ensured that everyone present remembered this moment clearly." Sir Julian looked from Holmes to Melville. "Why should that matter?" Holmes answered without raising his voice. "Because if all witnesses believe the ring appeared only then, the substitution must appear to have occurred afterward." He paused briefly. "But the substitution did not occur afterward." Melville's expression hardened. Holmes went on. "The duplicate ring was commissioned weeks in advance. I confirmed this with the village jeweler last night." A faint stir passed among the assembled family. The exchange took place before dinner began, while preparations were underway. At that time, several persons moved about the table arranging the ceremony. I noticed Mrs. Alden, the elderly nurse, stiffen slightly. Holmes inclined his head toward her. "Your movements beside the tray were observed. They provided a convenient distraction." The nurse looked bewildered. "I only straightened the cloth, sir." "And so you did," Holmes replied kindly. He then turned once more to Melville. "But the true difficulty in this scheme lay not in making the duplicate ring." Holmes lifted it from the table. "It lay in persuading Lord Harbury to use it without hesitation." Melville's composure began to falter. Holmes spoke with quiet precision. "A signet ring acquires the habits of its owner. The wear within the band reveals that the genuine ring has been used for many years. The duplicate bears no such history." He held the ring toward the light. "Yet last night Lord Harbury used it without noticing the difference. That could occur only if the substitution had already taken place before the ceremony began." Sir Julian stared at his cousin. "You intended to seal documents with the duplicate before the dinner?" Holmes nodded. "Precisely. With forged papers bearing the Harbury crest, Mr. Melville might later claim authority over portions of the estate." Melville's voice broke. "I was entitled to more than I was given." Lord Harbury regarded him steadily. "Entitlement is not inheritance." The matter was shortly afterward placed in the hands of the proper authorities. The genuine ring was recovered from a locked drawer in Melville's chamber, along with several unfinished drafts of legal documents bearing the family crest. Later that afternoon, Holmes and I walked along the gravel drive as our carriage waited near the gate. The winter sun had broken briefly through the clouds, casting long shadows beneath the yews. "It is remarkable," I said, "how carefully the entire deception was arranged." Holmes gave a quiet laugh. "The structure was admirable," said he, "but the flaw lay in assuming that objects do not remember the hands that use them." He glanced once more at the small leather case in which the Harbury ring had been returned. "The most elaborate crimes, Watson," he added, "are often committed beneath the appearance of perfect manners." With that observation, the curious affair of the Harbury signet came to its conclusion, leaving me once again reminded that in Holmes's hands, even the smallest mark of wear may prove more eloquent than the most convincing testimony. Thank you for listening to Nightmare Narratives. This narration and story are original productions created exclusively for Nightmare Narratives and may not be reproduced or re-uploaded without permission. If you enjoyed tonight's story, consider subscribing for more classic audiobooks and radio mysteries.